but rather what he or she believes in. The idea of a realm of unbelief is an illusion, similar to the others mentioned. Finally, the idea that techniques can operate without attention to purpose, fit for purpose, to their purposes, means that we cannot properly evaluate the moral appropriateness of things, a dangerous drift that forms part of the concern behind my title this evening. The title also uses the word politics, but it should be a review of the April 2017 document just a few weeks ago, put out by the Australian government in the hope that a new approach to citizenship within the test for Australian citizenship and Australian culture itself. Finally, I shall offer a conclusion and some recommendations based on what has gone before. So that's the frame of the lecture this evening. Part 1, the crisis of Western cultures. It's nothing particularly new to refer to Western cultures as being in crisis. Christopher Dawson referred to the crisis of Western education in his 1961 book of the same title, and I'm sure that with a bit of diligent digging, earlier examples of the crisis genre could be readily located. What is interesting at the moment, however, is that Paul Horowitz, for example, in a recent book published by Oxford University Press called The Agnostic Age, writes as follows: "We are now in the twilight of the liberal consensus as we have known it. It may survive with important revisions, or it may collapse altogether, and new prophets will arise to predict what will come after it. One thing, however, seems certain. The liberal consensus that emerged after the Enlightenment gelled in the 19th century and reached a more or less stable form in the 20th century cannot last much longer as a basic, unquestioned assumption about the way we live. From within and beyond its borders, the liberal consensus is under attack. On all sides, we are hearing calls, sometimes measured and sometimes shrill, for a revision or an outright rejection of the terms of the liberal treaty." Ronald Weed and John von Hiking, in a collection of essays examining civil religion, speak of a crisis of citizenship that is the result of the failure of secular society to satisfy fully its citizens' desires for meaningful community, consequent upon a failure to integrate fully the human personality into a schema of citizenship. This, in turn, the authors note, produces a crisis of political unity. A recent book by John Milbank and Adrian Paps called The Politics of Virtue, Post-Liberalism and the Human Future, just published in 2016, addresses what it terms meta-crises in relation to politics, economy, polity, culture, and the world itself. With respect to the meta-crisis of liberalism, the authors take a similar tack to that of Horowitz I just referred to, when they state, "The whole liberal tradition faces a new kind of crisis because liberalism as a philosophy and an ideology turns out to be contradictory, self-defeating, and parasitic on the legacy of Greco-Roman civilization and the Judeo-Christian tradition, which it distorts and hollows out." The authors state that the only genuine alternative is a post-liberal politics of virtue that seeks to fuse greater economic justice with social reciprocity. Australian Clive Hamilton has written of the disappointment of liberalism and catalogues a significant list of the maladies of affluence, as he calls them, that suggest that the psychological well-being of citizens in rich countries is in fact in decline. What all these authors suggest as essential is a recovery or creation of a richer moral and aesthetic framework for life in contemporary societies. They all speak of virtues and of the traditions that nurture such virtues. They do not speak of values, and with good reason, reasons that I will develop as in the next part of the paper. Language is always open to alternative forms of interpretation, and law is in the business of interpretation. What informs legal interpretation, however, are background notions such as what we mean by a secular state, what we mean by secularism, and what we mean by a state being neutral. Furthermore, is there a liberal consensus? What would such a thing as a liberal consensus be? What do we mean by values, and what are these in comparison to virtues? To take two of these terms important to this lecture, a wide variety of contemporary scholars have come to the conclusion that the liberal consensus, which for a time guided certain conceptions of law, has now broken down, and that values language is, if not bankrupt, at least in need of serious clarification if we believe that by its use we are conveying moral meaning. With respect to liberal consent, will continue to advocate for forms of interpretation that give their viewpoint particular advantage in the courts and politics. However, the fact remains that there is no longer, if there ever was, a consensus as to either the meaning of liberalism itself, or how it relates to law, or how law should approach certain kinds of disputes involving rights. And we can pursue some of these questions in the question period if you wish. The meaning of central terms such as equality and non-discrimination need to be viewed through the associational lens, or through the different contexts religion and sexual orientation are to be realized, to appreciate associational diversity and the need for principles of space sharing in an open society. Similarly, we need to be wary of claims that a particular position represents the state interest. More often than not, when what is at issue is a contestable viewpoint, the state interest is multiple, not singular. The state, simply put, should not have only one view on controversial matters. These are questions that the state should keep open as far as possible. For example, the nature of marriage. It is the nature of the pressures on pluralism, however, that as with theocracies of old, the new sectarians, as one author calls them, seek to claim the state interest or the public authoritative meaning, and their own viewpoints are one and the same with this singular public agenda. Secularism is not, as some claim, neutral, and when viewed historically was clearly a movement from its mid-19th century inception to drive religion out of the public sphere so as to both marginalize and privatize it against the idea of an inclusive public sphere, ignoring an associational dimension to religious liberty and the necessary diversity this would entail. Secularism, a term coined in 1851 by George Jacob Holyoake, if we look at the full-sized OED, and if we graph the use of the term, we see its steady increase in the late 19th century and through the 21st century. About the same time, we see the term values rise in popular usage and come slowly but surely to replace virtues as a form of moral language. Now, what you're hearing now is, as far as I'm aware, new. This attempt to put together the rise of values language with the rise of the concept of secularism as an ideology, okay? Could I see the graph? What this is called a, just tell you in a moment. One of my very brainy sons, who happened to have just finished his doctorate at Cambridge, said to me, "Dad, have you ever used an engram?" Well, I thought that was something you'd have to bend over to use, but it turns out, in fact, it's this thing. Now, Google has taken hundreds of thousands of books, newspapers, journals, every imaginable kind of printed medium, and it's scanned it and put it into a database. And this thing on Google allows you to take a term and search it. In this case, I've asked for the search to be from the year 1800 to the year, I think, 2011 or something. That's about as far up as you can come. The blue line at the top is the term secular. Well, we got secular first, doesn't matter. And the red one is secularism. What I wanted you to see here is that secular has had a relatively high and regular usage through this long period of time. Secularism really didn't exist at all until about, as I said, the mid-19th century, when Holyoake coined it in 1851, and then starts to rise actually quite steeply and continues at this rise. But note that with the blue line on secular, there's been an internal shift of the term from the concept of secular meaning the age or the times to secular as meaning non-religious. Let me define that a little more for you. In for example, the Roman Catholic tradition, the clergy are divided into two categories: secular clergy and regular clergy. The secular clergy are those that are in the cloister, are in the parish, in the world. They're dedicated to the work of the parishes. The regular clergy are those that are in the cloister. In a sense, they're dedicated to prayer and to eternity. Secularum, as the age or the times, was not a non-religious marker until about the mid-19th century as well, when it starts to take on that post-Enlightenment division between religion and the state. So we refer to the state as secular now, not meaning that it's bound by time, but meaning that somehow it's separated from religion. Okay? Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, this is the very interesting one, I think. The blue line here is the term virtues. The red line is values. And if you look at what happens to values about the late 19th century, it just shoots up. It comes to, as virtues is in steady decline, slow but steady decline, values becomes the term, okay? So if you can hold that first graph of secularism's rise in the mid-19th century, with this strong rise of values terminology use in the 19th century, you'll get a sense pictorially of what I'm trying to drive at now, and I'll develop that. Thanks very much. So what are values? The second part of my paper. What are values and how do they differ from virtues? The Canadian philosopher George Grant, part of a long line of writers who have addressed in various ways the shallowness or bankruptcy of values, made some extremely useful observations about values. He commented that what is comic, he says, about the present use of values and the distinction of them from facts is not that it is employed by modern men who know what is entailed in so doing, but that it is also used by religious believers who are unaware that in its employment they are contradicting the very possibility of the reverence they believe they are espousing in its use. Now, the list of philosophers, I don't have any time to develop them, but when this talk is published, you'll see in the footnote here, I've given a long list of books that include names like Alistair MacIntyre, John Rist, Peter Emberley, Edward Andrews, Alan Bloom, Pierre Manon, most recently the Frenchman, and so on. And I'll quote from some of them, particularly Gertrude Himmelfarb, now the historian. As Alan Bloom puts it succinctly, since values are not rational and not grounded in the natures of those subject to them, they must be imposed. They must defeat opposing values. Rational persuasion cannot make them believed, so struggle is necessary. Commitment is the moral virtue because it indicates the seriousness of the agent, says Bloom. Philosopher Edward Andrew has noted that there has only been partial awareness in the academy that the language of values entails that nothing is intrinsically good and no one is intrinsically worthy. Historian Gertrude Himmelfarb discusses in some detail the shift from virtues to values and attributes the proliferation of values through the social sciences, particularly to the work of the sociologist Max Weber and his use of the term. Here's what she says. Values, as we now understand that word, do not have to be virtues. They can be beliefs, opinions, attitudes, feelings, habits, conventions, preferences, prejudices, even idiosyncrasies, whatever any individual or group or society happens to value at any time for any reason. They are to be distinguished from virtues in that one does not say of virtues that anyone's virtues are as good as anyone else's, or that a person has a right to their own construction of what virtues entail. As Himmelfarb puts it, only values can lay claim can lay that claim to moral equivalency and neutrality. Most importantly, and it fits perfectly with what I identified above as 4 areas of current confusion about the state, this impartial, non-judgmental, as we now say, sense of values, as in value-free, is now so firmly entrenched in the popular vocabulary and sensibility that one can hardly imagine a time without it. Values is the language to use when there are no purposes beyond the self. What masquerades for justice when it is no longer a virtue is power unchecked by moral evaluation, because to have a moral evaluation, you must understand law as involving a standard that can be taught in relation to a category. In this case, the virtue of justice defined as rendering to another his or her or their due. And that due is itself a set of moral questions related to purpose and context. In his important essay from 1946, Politics in the English Language, George Orwell identified the role that meaningless words, as he called them, play in relation to politics, particularly the politics of authoritarianism. He says that thought can corrupt language, and language can in turn corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better, he says. In relation to the virtue of justice and the tradition of the virtues, is this sort of corruption not exactly what Orwell is getting at? He identifies, as a matter of fact, the terms progressive, equality, and values as examples of meaningless words, and yet they're the core of much of our contemporary political discourse. Finally, contemporary French philosopher Pierre Manon, in his recent book dealing with how France and the Christian West should respond to what he referred to as the Islamic challenge, says this of values. What is at work under the term equality or secularism? Notice how he's putting together the same terms that I've sort of come across in the same context. What is at work under the term equality or secularism, or under the formula values of the Republic, is the disqualification of all shareable contents of life for not having been chosen by each individual, or because they do not please each individual. It's easy to see that if humanity had begun its adventure by embracing such principles, neither families, nor cities, nor religious communities would ever have been created. If there is nothing in common but the values of the Republic, then according to Manon, all that amounts to is the dispositions that make it possible to live together without having anything in common. In order to escape this vertigo of dissolution, as he calls it, a common life must be formed, and this is a moral and religious task far beyond the vapid vagaries of values affirmations. Third part of my talk. The Australian citizenship oath and Australian values. Do they strengthen the test for Australian citizenship? How ironic and how fortunate for this year's Acton lecturer that mere weeks ago the Australian government decided to launch what it described as a project styled as strengthening the test for Australian citizenship. Emanating from the office of the Honourable Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, Peter Dutton MP, the document sets out the Australian government wishes to strengthen the pledge of commitment that forms a part of the Australian Citizenship Act 2017. Given what I have referred to above about the criticisms that have been around for many decades now regarding values language, it's somewhat ironic that the form that the Australian government's proposal takes is to strengthen the aspiring citizens' understanding of core Australian values. The term values, or the phrases Australian values, or core Australian values, or shared values, are invoked throughout the document against the supposed base of respect, freedom, and equality. To anyone who has worked with these terms in law, however, what constitutes equality is a notoriously slippery concept, and one that, in fact, only has meaning in context, not in general. Thus, discrimination is allowed in open societies as long as it is just discrimination, and that requires attention to the context of the distinction being made. Think, for example, of religious employer discrimination. We don't expect a Jewish synagogue to hire a Muslim imam. We allow them to make a distinction based on one of the prohibited grounds, namely religion. So on and so forth with disability and with age. We allow discriminations. Equality, therefore, can't possibly be in general, and yet it's frequently invoked in that way as a general and undifferentiated good. The government's assertion that the vague generalization constitutes social bonds that provide a foundation for society would be, to say the least, news to the philosophers who have provided robust debunking of values and the other terms the government now seeks to rely upon. The questions in the new test will, we're told, seek to confirm the applicant's values by assessing the applicant's views on such matters as democratic beliefs, freedoms, including respect for freedom of speech and rejection of hate speech, defined, interestingly, much more clearly than in the Racial Discrimination Act, Section 18C. Here in this proposed values document, it's hate speech is linked to incitement to violence, a linkage that I support, actually. It's the one we used in the South African Charter. We didn't support the more vague notions of insult or ridicule and so forth that were incidentally struck down by the Supreme Court of Canada a few years ago in the Watcott decision. That's an interesting fact for you Australians. The very language that's in 18C of your Racial Discrimination Act, the Commonwealth legislation, was, and that's been controversial in here and that many people want to defend in Australia, has in fact been found unconstitutional already in Canada. Equality, integration, respect, and freedom. These are the shared values that are supposed to accomplish a richer conception of citizenship. We are told that, quote, our values unite us and create social bonds between us. They provide the foundation of our society and a shared future in which everyone belongs, unquote. With respect to the originators of this project, which contains, I must say, many fine things, so don't take me as rejecting the thing entirely, that would be unfair. But I would like to suggest that their last statement, that values create the social bonds between Australians, to quote the old Irish adage, you just can't get there from here. What the philosophers have pointed out is that the language of values is not, as claimed, what unite a people or what creates social bonds, since the language is essentially constructed to be personal preference, not shared moral obligations. If what is sought is to create social bonds, as the document has it, what is needed is a shared moral language that is not afraid to be moral and to speak about the very traditions that the document elsewhere references as a commitment to a multicultural Australia. Yet it is precisely here, in the current metaphobia, it's a term I like, which I define as fear of metaphysics, that contemporary societies are so weak and in need of strengthening. I will return to this in the recommendation section at the conclusion of the lecture. Though it's beyond the scope of this lecture, it's important to point out that those who have commented upon the twin problems of a supposed value-free science and the theory of value judgments generally have noted that classical and Christian metaphysics have been submerged under the concepts of value judgments, so that in the words of one of these theorists, Eric Voegelin, a result of the use of value judgments is that a science of human and social order ceases to exist. In such a world, the metaphysics of the virtues is lost as well, and it is useful to recall that one of the cardinal virtues, those 4 cardinal virtues, everything hinges on them, is in fact justice. The other 3 cardinal virtues being wisdom, moderation, and courage. And you'll recall there are also 3 theological virtues in the Western tradition: faith, hope, and charity, the 7 together forming an elegant and essential formulation around which other virtues cluster. It might be useful to consider the symmetry between the rise of the concept of secularism, the term that, as I pointed out, was coined in 1851, and the mid-19th century taking off of the language of values. We saw that in the engram graphs that we put together there. So recall those graphs for a moment in your mind's eye. It is as if the very framework of values suited the materialistic intent of George Jacob Holyoake and the early secularists. Consider why a term that comes from the marketplace, the value of something, which is essentially its price, begins to replace the concept of a virtue, which was a shared category of moral meaning. In a phrase that is so useful, I often ask my students to write it down and memorize it. And I'm sure some of them that are here this evening could lip sync it with me as I say this. I'm not kidding either. The Canadian philosopher George Grant once said in a radio interview, "Values language is an obscuring language for morality used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed." I'll repeat that because it's so profound. Values language is an obscuring language for morality used when the idea of purpose has been destroyed. Values, then, is an obscuring language, giving us the illusion that moral discussion is underway. It fits perfectly into the post-Enlightenment bias against metaphysics referred to above. It is ideal for the world in which we believe the state can be neutral and that citizens can be unbelievers. In such a world, we need not articulate our moral convictions. When we are forced into that embarrassing situation of actually saying what our values are, the background axiom of the values universe appear, walk on and give us assistance. The first, you have your values and I have mine. And the second, don't push your values on me. Yet we need something to stand in George Grant's telling term of obscurity, for moral absence. So we comfort ourselves that values can be shared or core. Consider the Australian document. But as we never have to actually spell out what these values are or why they should be shared as moral obligations, we try to function as if we can give voice to values without ever having to name them as judgmental or aspirational truths. Values are preferences or options, and so the mediation between them is power and manipulation. As the natural law theorist Don Treves put it in relation to positivism and law, there is nothing other than the pernicious doctrine that might is right when natural law concepts are abandoned. Where values are concerned, what we have is something dressed up as a moral framework. That's nothing of the sort. Virtues are those aspects of living which we can perceive by reason, sometimes assisted in deeper levels by understandings gleaned from traditions of revelation. Virtues have been divided into those dispositions or attitudes related to conduct that are understood to be in conformity with what is right and wrong. Here they are to be understood as distinct from values, which are a matter more or less purely of personal choice. Sadly, this morally obscuring language of values is virtually everywhere today, in religion, politics, education, and law. It's on plaques where it shouldn't be. Further details are beyond the scope of this lecture, but what I wish to do here is to set out in broad brush a moral language that can be shared across communities and between them in a society that is secular, pluralistic, and multicultural. It's a large task, but I think it can be done. The good news in this lecture is that there are resources for a shared set of moral principles. This language of virtue has two main divisions. First, personal or associational virtues. The language of virtues is found using different terms in different traditions. In the Roman Catholic tradition, these are the theological virtues I mentioned a moment ago, faith, hope, and charity, and the natural virtues which contain the cardinal virtues of justice, wisdom, moderation, and courage. Civic virtues are somewhat different. Drawing from the American political philosopher William Galston, who writes on the shared resources necessary to his articulation of liberalism, but the categories of which are an excellent starting point for shared civic virtues, these may be listed as follows: social peace, rule of law, recognition of diversity, a tendency towards inclusiveness, minimum decency, ruling out the two great affronts, wanton brutality and desperate poverty, affluence, generating as far as possible for all discretionary and allowing as much as possible equality, proximate justice, public and private. Also, an opposition to what Galston calls elsewhere exist with public imperatives and largely free of them. This next point is very important, but also undeveloped. The law has a jurisdiction, and certain matters such as liberty and friendship are prior to law. Finally, conclusion and recommendations. The necessary limitations on the state and why civic virtues need to be more actively engage associations and their traditions. A renewal of federalism that recognizes, with respect, human diversity through diverse associational life is what is needed to counteract monistic domination. Consider the ubiquity of the terms global or inclusion without attention to the tendencies towards homogenization both of these entail. And the term inclusion, by the way, is now popping up like mushrooms after a rain. In the area I do quite a bit of work in, pluralism, I see a huge tendency for people to embrace inclusion at large without really defining what it means or what's wrong with exclusion. There's many exclusions that, as with discriminations, are perfectly just, acceptable, and necessary. But as with equality, inclusion is one of those dazzling terms that, if we're not careful, can blind us to what's behind it. This tendency towards homogenization is not a new one, as can be seen in the classic essay on the benefits of diverse associations, and here I refer to Lord Acton's essay on liberty. Acton compared and contrasted what he referred to as two views of nationality, which he said corresponded to the French and English systems. In the French system, nationality is founded on the perpetual supremacy of the collective will, to which every other influence must defer, and against which no obligation enjoys authority, and all resistance, he said, is tyrannical. This approach overruled the rights and wishes of the citizen and absorbed their diverse interests in a fictitious unity. Of this sort of system, Acton observed as follows. I'm going to read a fairly long quotation, but it's so good I indulge myself that way, if you don't mind. Acton says, whenever a single definite object is made the supreme end of the state, be it the advantage of a class, the safety or the power of the country, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or the support of any speculative idea, the state becomes, for the time, inevitably absolute. Liberty alone demands for its realization the limitation of the public authority, for liberty is the only object which benefits all alike and provokes no sincere opposition. In supporting the claims of national unity, governments must be subverted in whose title there is no flaw, and whose policy is beneficent and equitable. And subjects must be compelled to transfer their allegiance to an authority for which they have no attachment and which may be practically a foreign domination. What Acton refers to as the theory of unity views the nation as a source of despotism, and revolution, on the other hand, the theory of liberty, which opposes the theory of unity, regards the nation as a bulwark of self-government and the foremost limit to the excessive power of the state. For Acton, it was the tendencies of centralization, of corruption, and of absolutism which could be effectively opposed by the influence of a divided patriotism. More recently, the legal scholar Harold Berman wrote of the limits of the use of law to guide people to virtue, and in particular showed how the total application of state power to lead virtue was most realized under Soviet communism. There, in his words, not only the law, but all social institutions and all forms of social control in the Soviet Union, including the Communist Party, economic organizations, trade unions, the press, the school, the arts, and a host of others, were used to guide people to virtue. It is impossible to isolate the consequences of moral education through law from those of moral education through social, economic, and political institutions in general, unquote. Now, Berman here is using virtue in an almost ironic sense of relation to the virtue of the communist society, not a richer understanding of justice centered around an open civil society. Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, in a manner similar to Berman, has noted that there are essentially two models of society: that of the Marxist-Leninist vanguard party, made up of a revolutionary elite whose job was to ensure the satellization of all aspects of social life to the party. He mentions, as did Berman, trade unions, leisure clubs, even churches, all had to be permeated and made into transmission belts of the party's purposes. Leninism in its heyday, Taylor tells us, was one of the principal sources of modern totalitarianism. The other view, genuine civil society, is one in which society is not identical with its political organization, and a diverse set of associations are not only allowed but encouraged to flourish so as to establish what another philosopher of our time, Jürgen Habermas, has identified as life worlds, which must, to avoid being colonized by systems that are parasitic upon them, operate in ways free of total regulation. In addition, there are examples of how extra-governmental initiatives may be accomplished in relation to such principles as religion and culture, or civic virtues. The South African Charter of Rights, Religious Rights and Freedoms, 2010, and its explanatory notes in 2015, provide a strong example of an extra-governmental initiative. This charter developed under Section 234 of the South African Constitution, which is a very unique provision, which allows for civil society to create additional charters to enhance the culture or deepen the culture of democracy. An extraordinary insight in South Africa, partly driven by the fact that they have a one-party state. So if there was to be constitutional development, it couldn't simply be between one party and the courts, because there'd be effectively no additional voices. So Section 234 allowed for civil society charters, and the religious charter that I was privileged to be involved in was the first use of that provision. So civil society created that charter. You can see it on the web. It's easily findable. That document, emerging, as it were, from the ground up, set out various guidelines about virtues and respect for difference. And these can be expressed clearly. And I believe this to be an analog of how civic virtues could be framed and introduced into webs of learning here in Australia and elsewhere. There are other examples of sharing rich respect across religious divides, and the possibility of religions learning the limits of their own capacities in relation to the state. This is very important. In the same way that law has to become more aware of its jurisdiction, religions have to become aware of their limitations in relation to the state. One of the good things that the separation of church and state gives us is the idea of jurisdictional differentiation between religions and the proper functioning of the state. But a better formulation is not strict separation, it's really cooperation. That's the best formulation. That respects jurisdictional difference, but allows for useful cooperative endeavors in education or in healthcare between religion and the state. So the work of, I want to point out three examples now of where religious thinkers have understood the limitation of religion. The first is the work of the influential American Jesuit John Courtney Murray, who was the main influence on the Vatican II document Dignitatis Humanae, which sets out for the Catholics the limitations of the church in relation to the state. Writing about the same time from Turkey was the Muslim scholar Bediüzzaman Said Nursi, who died in 1960. He noted the corrupting influence that politics would have on the Muslim religion. More recently, Abdullah an-Naim in the States has noted that politics corrupts religion, and that if Sharia is legislated, it ceases, in his view, to be Sharia, just as Christians have noted that legislating Christianity corrupts the faith itself. Religions can learn to abjure theocracy, and non-religious movements must also learn this. Jacques Maritain, a French philosopher of earlier generations, wrote once of the possibility of what he called atheistic theocracy. From the Jewish perspective, Rabbi and philosopher David Novak of the University of Toronto has written powerfully about the resources within Judaism to re-understand rights within the idea of covenant and the importance of associational life to the common good. In the past year, I've been privileged to speak on several occasions to the New South Wales Humanist Association and to its Wednesday forums. On these occasions, I've been reminded powerfully of the common ground shared between humanists and religious believers on such matters as the idea of the human family and the dignity of the person. While there are obviously differences in the derivation of the concepts that we might share, the fact of the commonality of respect is a very important datum in the conversations that are necessary about shared virtues and the common good, as well as what forms of civic ordering are more just than others. That we are all believers here is important to keep in mind as we seek the common good. Understanding the role and nature of virtues, personal, communal, and civic public, may help us to bridge communities and religious and non-religious belief systems in the task of understanding what matters to us as human beings. We need in common to understand how the limits of both law and religion help us to realize human goods, including civic order, civic friendship, and sustained peace. What is also certain is that attempts to form civic bonds between different communities will require greater attention to the shared moral language of citizenship. This can but should not be an exercise in vagueness. It must build upon the civic virtues and rich traditions of civic friendship set out above, informing these with the richness and differences of the religious and moral traditions that form the basic allegiances of citizens in their community and family lives. Associations, chief amongst these the religions, frame the subsidiary dimensions to culture that are properly beyond the complete control of law and politics, and also the blank slate of a supposedly neutral state. The state, law, and politics are necessary but not sufficient to deal with the deeper issues that concern Western cultures. To deal more deeply and effectively, we need recourse to the headwaters that have always fed the waters lower down. And those are the religions and the communities and narrative traditions, other than religions, that have fostered for millennia key notions. The avoidance of religions, which forms a main plank of the platform of secularism, and similar unwillingness to examine the ongoing importance of religions to culture, is neither wise nor sustainable in future. Religions continue to be critical to culture, and their appropriate involvements alongside other groups, non-religious ones as well, to create a moral language for citizenship is now a matter of considerable importance. Values language, with its roots in private preference rather than rich narratives of moral obligation, is simply not fit for the purposes that are required. A reinvigoration of virtues is essential. Finally, recommendations. Recommendations for a better ground for Australian citizenship, moving away from values to embrace virtues and what associations can offer. Drawing upon the experience of that South African Charter of Religious Rights and Freedoms 2010 and the explanatory notes 2015, it's clear that cooperation about some of the most important matters to culture can, in fact, be agreed upon between widely divergent traditions. I would argue that this can and should be extended towards cooperative principles between religious and non-religious citizens. I would make these recommendations to strengthen what the Australian citizenship test and oath might reach towards. First, avoid the language of values and replace it with more descriptive moral and ethical language, religious and non-religious, including the recognition of civic virtues. 2, be more specific about concepts within the already recognized multicultural traditions and give more clarity about what a better society looks like, recognizing the various crises discussed in part 1 of this lecture. For example, seek the beliefs within multicultural traditions that support important ideals such as generosity, compassion, mercy, love, and forgiveness. Rather than shy away from the recognition of richer moral language in diverse associations, use such terms as the inherent dignity of the human person, the importance of the family, the importance of the human family, civic friendship, and the common good. Civic friendship alone is a rich literature going back to the Greeks that can inform our political understandings. Fourth, refer to such documents as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, 1966, and other relevant covenants, protocols, and agreements, including the South African Charter of Religious Rights and Freedoms that I've mentioned, highlighting the duty to strive to bring about full recognition of the civic virtues listed, as well as the idea of the common good. With these changes, Australia would be moving beyond values and would be making an important statement in relation to the identified crises now facing Western liberalism and the states that are drifting within it. Thank you.
Stay here, we'll do Q&A from here. Iain, thank you very much indeed for that very learned lecture. Thank you. We'll move now to some Q&A. We have two microphones. We have two microphones, so they'll pass around if you raise your hand. Please just wait for a microphone to come to you so that everyone else can hear. You can hear what happened at the opening when I started without a microphone. So if you could just wait, and one of my colleagues will bring you a microphone. While you're getting your thoughts in order, Iain, I'll ask a question. And to draw on your Canadian experience, where, of course, Canada has long had a policy of official multiculturalism, to what extent do you think multiculturalism, which in our experience in Australia at any rate, is accompanied by a reluctance to judge or to make evaluations between different cultures, actually makes it much harder to find those shared moral qualities, those shared moral characters that you say, I believe rightly, are so important. But doesn't official multiculturalism and policies of official multiculturalism actually make that much harder?
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, and it has particular bite in a Canadian context, because the federal government's multiculturalism policy in Canada was and remains rather controversial. People have said in Canada about that policy what has been said in France about it, namely that multiculturalism doesn't exist or it didn't work. My take on that is that what existed was a kind of pared down conception of multiculturalism. It wasn't a real attempt to get at what is shared as much as what was different. And that was bent, as it were, by the same kind of metaphobia, the fear of metaphysics, the fear of moral language and engagement that we see at the core of what I've been describing generally tonight. So I think multiculturalism hasn't really been tried and found wanting in many ways. It was not properly tried.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I have two quick questions. You talked early on that you said that the state should have a very open mind towards marriage. Does that mean an open mind towards traditional marriage, gay marriage, and multi-partner marriage? That's the first question. And the second question is, you talked a hell of a lot about rights. Everybody's got rights, but nobody's got any responsibilities. Could you enlarge on that, please?
Yeah. Well, of course, let me answer the second one first, because it's the easier one to answer. A right is defined as something that creates a duty. So rights and duties are related. A license or a liberty doesn't create a duty, okay? So to talk about rights without responsibilities means you don't understand rights. your first question about marriage is a difficult one because there's so many different things going on with the claims for marriage extension. Those people who want to have same-sex marriages, for example, now in Australia, as we saw years ago in Canada and as we've seen in the United States, they tend to only want certain kinds of marital extensions. In other words, they don't want polygamy, they don't want polyamorous marriages, they don't want bisexual marriages. I mean, if you think of sexual orientation as including a set of different types, even in the name LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, which, by the way, in Canada was put into statutory form as follows: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, two-spirited, intersexed, queer, and questioning. Okay, that's the Canadian legislative category, which means that if questioning is included, what isn't, right? Now, the problem with this endless extension is where do you draw the line and on what basis? Because the claim that sexual orientation gives the right to exercise it in marriage, why would you stop with just two people? I was counsel on some of the same-sex marriage cases, just so I can make my colors clear here, on behalf of interfaith coalitions, and always said that if you move beyond the maleness and femaleness of marriage, why on earth would you stop with the numbers aspect? Why would you stop with two? And sure enough, there was a case for multiple marriage in Canada emerging out of a certain fundamentalist or unusual Mormon group out of British Columbia, a place called Bountiful, ironically. But that claim was resisted by a judge on the basis that polygamous marriage, in fact, breached equality because women in polygamous marriages weren't accorded the same kind of rights as women in ordinary marriages. So this showed, I think, what I call any port in a storm jurisprudence, which is that the judges are wont to pull in a principle that suits them to get to an end that they may want, but it's not driven by any wider logic about the nature of marriage, which from time immemorial has been male and female because they alone produce children. The idea that what's come in with same-sex marriage claims is fascinating. It's also brought in a whole set of claims about procreation that necessarily extend procreation beyond two people, because two men can't produce a child without the assistance of the female, you know the biology. And so what's happened is that the natural dimension of marriage has been, in a sense, excluded by the claim of right for equal marriage treatment.
What do you mean about the state keeping an open mind?
Well, the state will make its decisions about marriage based in part on the debates that people bring to politicians and the response politicians will have to it. Unless you're in a Bill of Rights culture in which the judges are the court of first resort for changing culture. This is one of the refreshing things about an Australian context. You do not have the same ready recourse to judicial social activism that we see regularly in Canada or in the United States. In Canada, you didn't need to have a civic discussion about marriage equality because once you got it into the courts, you could just put pressure on the judicial mind to change it. The most dramatic example of this was the 2015 decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision, in which they managed to find the right to same-sex marriage in the American Constitution, where there's absolutely nothing said about marriage. So a judge can define anything as anything if they're of a mind to. And marriage equality, as I tried to say earlier, the term equality is so slippery, you can pretty much drive a horse through any aspect of it if you want to. So the government should have an open mind. Yes, democratic governments respond to the demands of people, right? My concern is on the other side, which is what about diversity and respect for difference? Because remember that the claim being levied for access to marriage equality tends to be based on a claim of diversity acceptance. Once that category has been achieved, one sees the fairly rapid evaporation of acceptance of diversity and an increasingly strident set of claims for civic totalism. And the Canadian experience has been a relentless series of litigations against religious groups, against charities, anyone who doesn't toe the line for the new category of marriage, which was not how it was originally argued for. It was argued for, let us into the category, but now it's a claim for domination of the category.
Thank you for a very profound talk. This might seem simplistic, but it's something that somehow we need to get into the community, the problems that we face. In my view, progressivism has become the dominant religion of the 21st century. The core belief is that government is the equivalent of a god. Government has the capacity not only to recognise but also to solve all the problems of humankind. The resultant faith in the power of government, which is pervasive, has undermined people's recognition of the need for our traditional social institutions because it absolves people from their responsibility for their own lives and to be considerate of others and to care for the needs of others. In propagating these beliefs, the schools have become the equivalent of churches, the universities equivalent of cathedrals, and many extraordinarily intelligent and creative people such as Richard Dawkins, Naomi Klein, Barry Jones and Philip Adams, the equivalent of apostles. There appears to be no recognition of this is important it seems to me, of the inherent systematic defects in political processes, notably, for example, rent seeking, vote buying, and the problem of rational ignorance, that being that the only direct control of the individual over government is a single vote once every 3 years for a whole package of things which it's a waste of time thinking about, and they don't. Thank you. I'd just like your views on that. I'm sorry.
Well, without being flippant about it, I agree with you. I agree with you, and I think you will actually find some very interesting support for your concerns, and beautifully wrapped up in this book I referred to in my talk by John Milbank and Adrian Pabst, called The Politics of Virtue, Post-Liberalism and the Human Future, published by Rowman and Littlefield last year. I think, and I have no financial interest in the book, sadly to say, because I think it's going to be a massive bestseller. It's a very important book. It discusses the kind of thing you're talking about, because the kind of politics we have now in the West is really quite obscene. It's oligarchic, for a start. We don't really have, in my view, a system that's responsive to fairness in terms of all kinds of measures of equality, fairness, access. We have the Trump-Clinton debacle, as far as I'm concerned, should have made us all aware that politics has massively gone off the rails. No matter what side of that obscene thing you supported, it was obscene.
Professor Benson, since the equivalent of 18C has been deemed unconstitutional in Canada, how is it that the roadblocks which exist in Australia now to prevent the repeal of 18C have been overcome in Canada, and why cannot they be overcome in a similar way in Australia?
Yeah. The answer to that is really the difference that I was hinting at about you not having a full Bill of Rights. I mean, 18C, the equivalent language, 4/5 of 18C, not all of 18C, was gutted in the Watcott decision of the Canadian Supreme Court. That was done by judges. Your failure to have the Turnbull Amendment, which would focus on harassment, right? I think that was the term they were going to use. That failed for political reasons. They didn't have the mandate because they had too thin a majority. So that was a political failure, not a judicial analysis question.
That's right, just speak up. Sorry about that. Okay. Maybe this is just two difficult questions. What do you think of the role of states? So how do we put limits on states? And second one is, if you think states have open-minded, the state is consist of individuals who have their own belief. And do you see the state
We just gave them to it, but none of them were switched on.
role of moral superiority?
Yeah. The first question, what should be the limits of the state? I think it's a very important question. In the same way that law has a jurisdiction, politics has a jurisdiction. And it's important that there are matters that are really prior to politics. Liberty, for example, shouldn't be controlled by politics, nor should the family, nor should basic conditions that are not granted by law. Those things are not the subject matter of law or of politics. They're prior to it, prior to the state. It's very important because we're in a period of time that the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben refers to as living under what he calls the hypertrophy of law, and it would also apply to the state. Hypertrophic conditions are those conditions in biology where something grows beyond its proper form, starts to mutate, like a tumor is hypertrophic. So we have a situation now where people are looking to the state to compensate for failures in associational life, or the state has expanded beyond its proper role to take over aspects of civil society that really should be free of state control. So we have an overly regulated set of cultures. That tends to be the problem that arises. Does that answer your question?
So what's the actual role of state then?
Well, I see the role of the state as kind of a traffic cop to in a sense, regulate as necessary between the different dimensions of culture, but not to usurp the proper functioning of other aspects. So I think what's happened is that the importance of civic associations, which is very, very important, and religions are key here. I mean, we're suffering now from a real problem, which is that the things that have formed the whole Western traditions, namely the active, vibrant religious life, has now been essentially, in many ways, swallowed up. If you go into many churches, you see that they haven't reached the young the way they would like to have. So there's a real problem of continuity and transmission. And this is very, very serious for culture because the backbone of Western cultures were the insights derived from religions.
Professor Benson, thank you for your learned lecture. My question is, how can the Catholic Church apply, I guess, a disciplined definition of virtue in its own kind of society, so in its institutions, in its schools, in its parishes, in its agencies, in its social works, when there are not enough people who would ascribe to these virtues to fulfil these functions, or at least it seems in the practicalities of the HR recruitment process, there aren't enough people who ascribe to these virtues. The traditionally faith, hope, charity, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. For example, we have the organisation I work in, we have a sort of a team mission. And the first thing it says is we ascribe to Christian values, which, as you said in your lecture, it's so vague that it means no one can really disagree with that, and also no one can really agree with it. So it's all right if you don't have any full answer to that question, but that's what I'd like to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would agree with your observation that the Catholic Church has been deeply compromised by its acceptance of values frameworks. This is such a problem within that tradition, and it's worth mentioning it because that was the tradition that, in a sense, still has in its catechism the virtues as the frame, the 4 cardinal virtues, 3 theological virtues. They're very important within the Catholic faith. Fortunately, the catechism doesn't spend a lot of time discussing values, but unfortunately, Catholics do, particularly Catholic educators. When I searched amongst older Catholic philosophers for reasons as to why this happened, they were various. One was the general influence of a culture which, as the graph showed, had been swallowed by values language for a long time. That's part of it. Submersion in the general lexical inundation. That's the first thing. The second is another problem. Why does St. John Paul II use it in encyclicals when he really shouldn't have? And I say shouldn't have because when you translate his writing back into Latin, he can't, because there's no values in Latin. So it goes back in the Catholic, it's one of the great jokes of time is that the Catholic Latin version contains the term bonum or bona, meaning the good. And the good is the good, it's not your values. So the irony is he wrote his encyclicals in Polish, then they were translated into other languages. And in Polish, he chose values rather than virtues. Why? Because he was influenced by a stream of philosophy. I don't need to go into the details, but the fact of the matter is that this language of values, which Weber introduced into philosophy through the social sciences and philosophy, ends up proliferating right through a particular kind of philosophy known as phenomenology, and that became influential on certain theologians. And unfortunately, I don't think it should be in the church. I don't think it helps. I understand what they were trying to do. They were trying to connect. The problem is that things are heard, as Thomas pointed out, in the manner of the hearer, and if you hear values as being what you personally believe, but it has no touch on me, you've diminished the idea of an objective moral horizon into personal preference. And this is such a profound emptying out of the sharing of moral meaning that it can't really be used. It's the equivalent of running across a burning bridge as the bridge has become thin as carbon sticks. And I don't think that bridge can bear the weight that the moral tradition requires of a bridge. So I would suggest jettisoning values. And I did suggest it at the Vatican at Pontifical Academy some years ago when Marianne Glendon was in the chair. And she said, you know, Iain, you've made a very compelling argument about values language, but what are we supposed to do? We've been using this language for decades. And I quoted Chesterton, the immortal Chesterton, who said, you know, when you realize you're on the wrong road, the most sensible thing to do is get on the right one.
Thanks, Iain. That was superb. But just a simple question. What's the possibility of you repeating this performance in the Parliament House? Or perhaps a soiree with Peter Dutton being very cooperative and educational?
You can answer that as you wish.
I think that's a question for Peter Curti and the think tank in whose premises we're currently situated.
Well passed. The lady at the back. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Max.
I probably don't need it. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I just really wondered what you felt about Ayaan Hirsi Ali being excluded from the country. She was not allowed to come in to lecture. I saw her twice last year and loved every minute of it. And I don't think that this, personally, I took great offence at it. Am I allowed to take great offence at it?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I can't really comment on the specifics because I don't know them, so I won't. But this concept of no platforming, if that's what it's at issue, is not a healthy one, with one exception. If somebody's advocating violence or inciting violence, then I would exclude them. But short of an incitement to violence, I think an open society has to tolerate maximally the diversity of viewpoints. It's essential to freedom. So when South Africa excludes the Dalai Lama on the grounds of their business dealings with China, Desmond Tutu, in my view, was absolutely right to go ballistic. And I think you're absolutely right to be upset about the situation you describe.
I certainly can't imagine anyone less violent.
Thank you for that question and for all the questions. I'm afraid that we really need to wrap up the Q&A now, but thank you very much for those very thoughtful questions and for sort of prodding the ground, really, on which you've been at work, Iain. I'd call upon my colleague, Bishop Rob Forsyth, to give the vote of thanks. Iain, you might want to stay up here.
Goodies. Oh, one you're going to need. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Benson, it's a great privilege, somewhat intimidating privilege, I might say, to give the vote of thanks after that extremely thought-provoking lecture. A sign of a great thought thinker is that when you hear what they say, you think, that's obvious, but it never would occur to you in a million years until you heard it. And that's how I felt tonight. and somewhat diminished by that thinking. I really appreciate the way in which you urge us to think about words that we take for granted and realise how often they're quite specious. Very, very helpful. And to clarify, and at the same time to deepen, I'm a bit trapped here now, clarify and deepen words. I'm not quite as pessimistic as you about values, in the sense that I find people really do believe in right and wrong, and I've had to, that's about right and wrong, not just your values. In fact, there's a lot of that talk going around, and I'd like maybe later on to talk further about what that indicates. I don't always agree with the content of the right or wrong. There's strong feelings on the matter. And I think I appreciated very much your comments about the limits of religion and of politics and of the law. Now, if you just said religion, I'm a religious man, I would be suspicious. But as you mentioned the law, I know you're not self-serving. And that actually is a sign of a healthy society in which there are valued cooperation and basically self-imposed limits rather than... It's a great vision of a world which no longer is afraid of asking what's the reality behind truth and behind what's good. No longer any metaphobia. I'm looking forward very much to getting a copy of the lecture. I don't know what you all think, but I feel I ought to read it again. I tried taking notes. That was impossible. Because there was so much good stuff coming, one after the other. And so all I can just say to you, sir, is that we're deeply in your debt. And it's exactly what we in the Religion and Civil Society program are looking for. You've set us a whole agenda of ways of thinking. I have some goodies here. One, by the way, given the notorious air conditioning in this room, you'll like it, is actually, it looks to me, something warm. And the rest, another tie. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much, Rob. And again, Iain, thank you very much. Well, you saw the blinds going up a moment ago. I think that's an indication that it's time for us to be moving on. Thank you very much for joining us tonight at the CIS for our 2017 Acton lecture. At the end of May, let me just tell you that we'll be holding the annual CIS Helen Hughes lecture. This is as a memorial to one of our great contributors over many years, the late Helen Hughes, an economist, a very distinguished economist. This year, the Helen Hughes lecture will be given by John Slater. Do keep an eye on our website, cis.org.au, for more details. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and we'd be delighted if you would do just that. Good night to you here in Sydney, and good night to you, to those of you who have been following us on the live stream. It's been great to have your company tonight. I wish you a safe journey home, and again, thank you very much for joining us at the Centre for Independent Studies. Good night.